Welcome to the second season of Coffee and Conflict, the National Security Institute's literary podcast, where I welcome leading experts to discuss their research, their books, and the most pressing defense and foreign policy issues of the day. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at NSI and senior vice president at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So grab your first or second coffee of the day, and let's begin. I'm joined today by Franz-Stefan Gady, an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. He has advised militaries in Europe and the United States on structural reform and the future of high-intensity warfare. He's a former senior fellow with the Institute for International and Strategic Studies, focused on future conflict and the future of warfare. He's also held various positions at the East-West Institute, the Project on National Security Reform, and the National Defense University. He's conducted extensive field research in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Ukraine, where, among other things, he embedded with the Afghan National Army, NATO forces, Kurdish militia, and the Ukrainian armed forces. He's also reported on a wide range of countries and conflict zones as a journalist. He joins me today, though, to discuss his new book, How the U.S. Would Fight China, published by Hearst in London. It is an outstanding book, exceptionally timely book. It was one that's been on my list since the beginning of the year when I first saw it. I picked it up in London on a most recent trip, and I could not put it down all the way through my research trip in Lithuania. So welcome to
Oh,
the podcast. I'm incredibly excited to host you.
well, thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you so much for having me. And I should say that it is out now in the United States with Oxford University Press. Just a little plug there.
Fantastic. We'll make sure we get the link in the show notes for this because I really recommend people pick this up. It's a great Christmas gift for one thing, but it's also just a fantastic book in and of itself. I really want to start, though, with sort of first principles here before we really dive into it. How do you characterize the American way of war?
Yes, I mean, there are obviously different ways to look at it, but I think in its essence, over the last couple of decades, the U.S. character of war was essentially premised, on the one hand, on an abundance of resources, superiority in technology, um, just at the strategic level and at the operational level, trying to seek a decisive engagement right at the outset of hostilities. At least that's the theory. And as I point out in my book, the United States, in a way, has been a military comeback power in most of its great power wars in the past, right? Where it usually gets a bloody nose at the beginning, and then little by little it's catching up with the adversary, and usually fails to actually have that decisive engagement right at the outset of a conflict. And I think incidences or wars like the Gulf War are an exception. I'm really specifically here talking about great power war, but I mean, going uh, all the way back to the U.S. Civil War, if you pick the Union side, right, it took them a couple of years to figure out what to do. And what's interesting to me, and why I actually also wrote that book, is that attrition is actually one of the principal characteristics, I think, of the U.S. Warfighting approach. But attrition has gotten a really bad name uh, in U.S. military circles and society in large, for obvious reasons, because it means that you do actually spend a lot of resources, manpower, and material on achieving a military objective, right? Of actually concluding a war victoriously, or at least successfully or favorably on your terms. And I think all of this together makes for an interesting mix, because on the one hand, we still believe that superior technology can actually enable us to achieve a decisive outcome. Whereas the reality is, as history has shown, that usually when the United States engages in a great power war, it actually takes some time to conclude it. And it is actually marked by a tremendous amount of loss on both sides. And I think these are sort of contradictory impulses that I tried to outline in my book. And what's important to know, that still the conception of fighting against a great power like China, first and foremost, rests on this idea that we need to have a decisive engagement, or at least essentially meet the adversary decisively right at the outset of a military confrontation. That's almost baked into US military culture, despite what you read and hear based on my research, right? There are lots of documents that say that a war against China is going to take quite a bit of time, consume a lot of resources, that there's no real quick fix to it, that there is actually we shouldn't expect like a early termination of such a conflict. That's all okay. We can actually talk about this, but my book actually, I mean, what I try to point out is there is actually no plan B in a war against China if the first round doesn't really conclude successfully for the United States. There is no plan B.
What I find really fascinating throughout the course of this book is that the American way of war that you just described here is predicated on pretty significant assumptions, in terms of communications dominance, information dominance, ISR dominance. But as you write, these things can't be taken for granted. And can you kind of explore upon that how almost these domains, the space domain and the cyber domain in particular, whereas we have sort of the assumption of dominance, we can't take that for granted anymore, even if we really could have at one point.
Yes, I don't think that is the United States, could ever have taken that for granted. And I think it also gave us uh, experiences of the US Armed Forces in the Gulf War in the 1990s and obviously during the Afghanistan-Iraq wars painted, I think, a wrong picture of what kind of future operational environment to expect, and also helped actually reinforce some bad tendencies within the armed forces, I would say, when it comes to thinking or clinging to that belief that the United States will always be able to at least temporarily maintain superiority in the space domain, in the cyber domain, and frankly in the air domain, right? Because all of this is interlinked. This is essentially the quintessence of the American way of war at the tactical level, I would say, right? Is this idea of achieving air superiority, and of course it trickles down, upwards to the operational level as well. But achieve essentially superiority in the air, achieve superiority in space, because this is the key domain, enabling domain, along with the cyber domain. These are the two key enabling domains for what I also describe quite in detail, precision or standoff precision warfare based on a systems warfare approach, right? As I outline in my book, which essentially just means that you see your adversary as essentially a system that you need to dismantle, and you are trying to identify those knots, those neural knots that if you hit them will essentially collapse the adversary system. And there's a whole philosophy behind all of this, right? This idea that you achieve essentially cognitive dominance, information superiority, all these things that, the terms that you have also mentioned. It all basically means just one thing, that you try to figure out the adversary system. You have an accurate understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of that system, and then you try to asymmetrically essentially lead to the collapse of that system by essentially not having to kill the system, destroy the system, but just collapse it, or essentially force the adversary military commanders to capitulate because they're unable to control this system any longer. This might sound really abstract, but in reality, this has been the US philosophy, and there's a whole a history of concepts and doctrine behind all of this, and it really feeds into conceptions about how we fight, how we intend to fight future wars, and I think that's a danger, because the one thing that I think we have seen over the past couple of years with the war in Ukraine, but also where we are heading in other parts of the world, is that attrition. I mean, you can essentially throw attrition out the window. It will come back into your house through the back door, and there's no real. It's unclear to me in terms of uh, achieving military success, or establishing a coherent theory of military success for your own force, how you really can go about essentially blinding your adversary or blinding that system, and then collapsing that system at the same time, right? I think we are delusional to think that by essentially hitting your adversary's command and control nodes, by essentially blinding him, by shutting down his means of communications with its forces and so forth, that we can actually force a quick and relatively, at least for our own side, bloodless decision. And these are all the themes that I'm discussing in my book, essentially. And I wrote it first and foremost because when I started researching on the future of warfare, you obviously know that China is the pacing threat for the U.S. armed forces. The U.S. armed forces are the most advanced military in the world. They have a tremendous cultural, doctrinal, um, and conceptual influence on other militaries in within NATO. So whatever happens in the United States will have repercussions for the development of military forces across the West. And so it's really important to see what the United States is doing. And in my book, I am talking about a potential war with China between um, the United States Armed Forces and the People's Liberation Army. But I think there are larger principles that I want to outline and larger discussions that we really have to ask in all our armed forces in Europe and in other parts of the world regarding the future of warfare and whether the basic premise of information dominance, information superiority, winning decisively, accelerated kill chains, something that I haven't really mentioned just yet, but it really feeds into this, that you essentially quickly try to identify the adversary system and then identify the targets and then quickly hit that target with precision strike capabilities. Whether that actually is a coherent theory of success, and I see a disaggregation of the different levels of war, right? At the tactical level, the operational level, and then the strategic level. And I think we refuse to answer first order questions, right, with regard to a potential military confrontation with China. The first order question is it really wise to actually even try to contemplate a military conflict with China if you're the United States, if you're a great power, and if by all the games that I've seen, even within a fairly good, within the parameters of a good outcome, you basically wreck a fair high percentage of your force by achieving a favorable outcome. And this is really not going into the larger question whether Taiwan is worth defending, what Taiwan really
Mhm.
means for the US national interest. This presupposes that obviously we have an interest in defending Taiwan for strategic reasons and other reasons. This is really just a discussion of what it would cost to essentially fight China and whether this is actually something that we are prepared to do given the losses that this would possibly or most likely entail.
There's so much that's in there that I really want to unpack, and it's again, it's a fantastic book, and I really recommend people pick it up. I want to go to the adversary perspective for a moment here because you talked about just now how American military doctrinal and operational adaptation, innovation, and the lessons and things that are prepared have shaped other adversaries and allies alike. When you look at the timeline from sort of 1991 to 2003, the Iraq invasions, all the way through to Ukraine, how have you seen, and you talk a bit about it here in the book, the PRC and the PLA sort of adapt to this very technological heavy component? Because one of the key themes that I drew from your book was the risks that the American pursuit of decisive battle risks both horizontal and vertical escalation because of the way that the PLA and the PRC writ large have developed their systems, I imagine, impartially in response to American military overmatch.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. And I think what's less appreciated are these vertical and horizontal escalatory risks baked into how the United States would envision to fight a war with China. And I think I outline in the book that essentially the United States could actually get the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, actually lose the initial phase of a war with China because it fails to actually achieve information superiority, cognitive dominance, right? Which again essentially just means that you have a good understanding of your adversary system, right? Know where to hit the adversary and what to destroy, what to disaggregate, and so forth, right? All these terms in military doctrine that are being used here. And then at the same time, also, though, by doing so, actually create escalatory risks that could potentially take that conventional war to a nuclear level. And you can't rule that out. And I think any sort of great power war, whether nuclear weapons are actually used on the battlefield or against civilian infrastructure, nuclear weapons are playing a huge role. And one reason why I wrote this book was also because I think we sort of not forgot, we lost the ability to think through great power war uh, through the nuclear lens. And also in war games, usually you divide up the conventional and the nuclear part, right? Or you specifically try to game out only the nuclear part, and you forget. And I think it's this transition period that's really hugely important. And I spent a lot of time in Ukraine, covered that conflict. Um, Remember, for example, in October 2022, when there were newspaper reports that Russia might be using or might consider to use nuclear weapons in the event that the front line would collapse, right? It never materialized. Russia didn't use nuclear weapons, but it certainly raised nuclear escalatory fears. And what we saw in DC in the United States was a bit of a policy freeze, right? We didn't quite know how to handle the situation and what to do. It took a while to respond, although there was obviously a very clear response that the United States would potentially escalate, but not at the nuclear level, but with perhaps long-range precision strikes against targets inside Russia. But it certainly was a huge factor in terms of what military aid we were willing to give to Ukraine, and climbing up this escalation ladder slowly as a result, right? And always in the back of our minds, the grand strategy of the United States and Europe as a result in Ukraine, because Russia has nuclear weapons, is that whatever we are doing, we can't get into a direct military confrontation with Russia over Ukraine. And Russia knows this. So Russia actually has escalation dominance. So now we are talking about, seizing frozen assets and all these other, like weapons deliveries and so forth. Yeah, that's all very well. But I mean, the first order question here is, would we actually be willing to go to war against Russia over Ukraine? And the answer here is no. So my point is that nuclear weapons are playing a huge role. And I think we disregard this role in a US-China conflict at our own peril by essentially saying, well, the United States is not willing to use nuclear weapons. China is unlikely to use nuclear weapons. I would say that's not true. I think China specifically has developed concepts, or at least tries to be as ambiguous as possible to essentially offset US military strength in certain categories, just because I think China strongly believes that at the end, because Taiwan is much closer to China's national interests, so to speak, than the United States, that China might have escalation dominance in a similar conflict. And so looking at nuclear weapons and what role they could play is hugely important. And I think what's important to understand here is that, as I describe in the book, the US approach to essentially forcing a quick decision in a war against China, even if it's not successful, and as I write in my book, it's unlikely to be successful for multiple reasons. And a lot of US military thinkers, you talk to military officers, know that. But just by pursuing this approach, you actually already are raising escalatory risks by targeting dual capable systems on the Chinese side, at the same time also blinding ISR capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, command and control capabilities. There's an issue of entanglement potentially also when it comes to command and control capabilities, although that's really unclear. I think that's something that we can't really get a good answer from based on solely unclassified material. But it's there, and it's something that we need to take into account. And just imagine the situation: the first couple of days of a war between the United States and China in the Taiwan Strait. The United States has spent a tremendous amount of precision-guided munitions. China has hit back, casualties on both sides. And then you, as a US military commander, you go down the target sets essentially, right? And then the question is, should we actually start hitting targets on the Chinese mainland? China knows that, so China obviously will have countermeasures in place, probably also feeding into US nuclear escalatory fears and so forth. So all of this together makes for a very, very dangerous situation. And I think we would do very well to take that into account when it comes to our fighting concepts, operational concepts, and tactics, and how we approach this. Also, because frankly, at the end of the day, again, I come back to this issue of a first order question: how would we define victory, or what would be our theory of success against a war? Uh, with China, and that to me is also unclear.
No, you raised a lot of very interesting points there. It reminds me, I was in a conversation with a PLA expert and talking about the space component in particular. And they're having track two discussions that were relating to this conversation and the risks of misunderstanding PRC versus US red lines. And he was saying that in one conversation that he had with a representative of the PLA, former officer, that in the event of hostilities, they would target American space-based infrared systems to signal. And he said, well, that would be us, Beijing, signaling our red lines. And the American interlocutor said, well, that would be an act of potential war for us because that's our command and control early warning system. Do you, in your conversations with sort of American military officers and representatives of the Pentagon, that risk in those red lines, do you see an understanding of what our red lines would be, but also what the PRC's red lines when we start talking about this risk of escalation?
Yes, I think there's some obvious red lines, right? And the paradox here is though that when you actually look at how the United States would envision to fight such a war, the red lines make it almost impossible to succeed in a sense, because by blinding Chinese space assets, by blinding assets in cyberspace, right? Because I mean, I also have a chapter just on cyber, and essentially saying that the United States will have most likely superiority in cyberspace, at least temporarily, and that it has superior cyber capabilities, and as a result can also conduct most likely successful cyber strikes, at least for a while. This obviously has consequences also for US success in the space domain. China can obviously retaliate, but at the same time, by essentially achieving superiority in cyberspace, temporarily, I should say, right? Because I don't think that's a permanent state. Uh, you are already crossing a lot of Chinese red lines, and the United States knows this, and vice versa, right? So for me, I think what's important would be some sort of clear-cut military dialogue when it comes to all of this. Conversations, you mentioned track two discussions. But again, for me, what's much more interesting is that I wonder whether people see the contradiction here, that our conception of warfare is essentially predicated on blinding, destroying, disabling the very capabilities that China would likely see as red lines being crossed here, and robbing also the People's Liberation Army of reining in any sort of escalation. And here I think there's a larger issue involved in all of this, and that's really what I would call the precision strike paradox. A colleague of mine, Amos Fox, has written about this as well, but I'm also mentioning it just from a basic understanding when it comes to what kind of warfare we are envisioning, or what kind of warfare or operational environment we are likely going to be seen in a military confrontation against China, right? And that's going to be dominated by precision strike, standoff precision strike capabilities. And the idea really behind standoff precision strike capabilities is that they're going to shape the battle space, the battlefield. You're going to hit your adversary before you actually need to engage in close combat. And by doing so, you actually gain an advantage over your adversary. And because of superior ISR capabilities, superior space and cyber capabilities, you're much faster at identifying targets on the battlefield, and you can blind your adversary from doing the same. And you hit these targets more accurately and faster, right? That's what's called a fast closing of the kill chain. You're linking sensors. Um, and shooters, and all of this together could potentially work. But in reality, what you actually are doing is not so much bringing the war to a fast conclusion, but on the contrary, from all the evidence that we've seen over the last couple of years and the evidence that we've seen in Ukraine is that precision-enabled warfare actually uh, furthers attrition. That is, it prolongs the military confrontation, and that's, I think, crucial to understand. So essentially, what you're trying to achieve here, the paradox is that by essentially trying to force your adversary to capitulate quickly because of overwhelming firepower, firepower, chances are that you're actually achieving the opposite effect, and that has multiple reasons. But I think the most important one um, is that by essentially eliminating command and control knots and essentially robbing your adversary of commanding and commanding uh, his or her uh, forces in the field and really robbing the adversary of any kind of command and control capability, the adversary's force is becoming leaderless. And the idea would be that once a force is leaderless, it's going to capitulate. In reality, what we've seen is that the opposite is very often the case, that these forces are not capitulating, rather they're fighting on, and there's an unclear picture of what's really happening within within these forces, and it creates a very dangerous situation again, where the side that's being blinded essentially can't really control escalation. You can get into a use it or lose it situation when it comes to certain capabilities, including nuclear weapons, and then there are also other technical reasons why attrition is likelier than a quick decisive campaign when it comes to precision strike warfare. And one reason is also that it's extremely difficult not to actually try to engage as many targets as you can. If you have complete battlefield awareness, you're much quicker at expanding your precision strike capabilities. And I think what I've seen also in Ukraine, by doing so, by essentially having 100, 200 targets out there, it's much more difficult to prioritize targets. So it's much more difficult to actually mass your precision fires on a transparent battlefield. And that's also something to take into account in the event that you can actually achieve full transparency in the battle space, which I also think to a certain degree is an illusion. But all of this feeds into, I would say, the attritional character of such a military confrontation.
Building off of that, because I think one of the things we haven't discussed about yet in the context of the attritional fight is the generation of mass and sustainment of mass. We've seen successive, particularly over the course of this year, concerns about American stockpiles, the drawing down because of conflicts in the Middle East, aid and support to Ukraine, the Pentagon freezing for a time precision strike deliveries to Ukraine that was later restarted by the White House. From your perspective, and certainly you go into it quite a bit in the book, where does the United States stand in terms of its capacity to sustain a fight today, let alone sustain an attritional fight that we might see in with the People's Republic of China over Taiwan?
Yeah, and I think what's important to understand here also that you can't take Taiwan in isolation, right? You need to look at the wider strategic or geopolitical situation here, and the truth is that the United States, as a great power, the dominating great power in the international system, needs to think about a two-theater war strategy, war fighting strategy. So it's an illusion to think that you're going to pass off essentially Europe to the Europeans, the Middle East to partners and allies there, and you can exclusively focus on China or East Asia in this, right? Because the United States plays a crucial military role in all these other regions. So the forces that you bring to an East Asia theater is going to be much more limited than you would assume. And I outline actually for air and naval forces, but also for ground forces, how many troops we could actually expect and what kind of assets, military hardware, and so forth, we can actually most likely see in such a military campaign. And it's not as much as you would think, first of all, and it actually amplifies my larger second point that I'm trying to make here, that is the United States precision strike stocks are in no way adequate to actually launch a sustained standoff precision strike campaigns against Chinese targets in the long run, especially, and that's important, if China does not concede defeat. So there is enough ammo, most likely, to perhaps sink an invasion fleet in the Taiwan Strait. There's enough ammo to destroy a certain percentage of the People's Liberation Army. But the question is, when would China concede defeat? And the only way how you can actually get a war to terminate on favorable terms for your side is if the other side concedes defeat. And China most likely will have no incentive to concede defeat, even if it loses its entire fleet in the Taiwan Strait, just because it knows that the United States is going to run out of precision strike capabilities eventually, that the United States force structure is brittle, that the United States actually does not want to sustain a war of attrition in East Asia for the sake of Taiwan, most likely, because there's no real large political consensus around this. So all of this together, in my opinion, makes it for not a great proposition for the United States to kick off such a military confrontation currently. Would it be better if there would be a larger precision strike stockpile? Yes, but would it actually address any of the fundamental questions or issues that I've outlined? I don't think so. And that's an issue. And so, in my opinion, it would be extremely difficult for the United States to come up with a coherent theory of success in a war against China, independent of what I outline in the book, or where I spent most of my time on when it comes to these new operational concepts that the United States Armed Forces are actually experimenting with and testing out. Because the fundamental issue is, and that's again, I think, a cultural issue, that there's a great propensity behind all of this to actually substitute strikes for strategy. And I mentioned that in the book. Strike for strategy, that's usually the approach. And strikes are usually, that's something that's happening at the tactical level. Has been elevated because how the United States envisions future warfighting to the operational or even strategic level. And the idea is, if we just get that part right, if we have enough precision guided munitions, if we have enough assets available, we can actually achieve war termination on favorable grounds. And I just don't think that's the case. Even if you increase the stockpile by a factor of 10, China still has the ability to probably wait that out. So I write in the book that we focus a lot of time on the first couple of days of such a military confrontation. I would be very interested what would happen in a war against China day 30, day 60, day 90. Would we see a lull in the fighting because at some point precision strike capabilities are going to be so depleted that you probably wouldn't be hitting a lot of targets anymore? Both sides would probably also suffer from a certain level of degradation in space, in the space domain, ISR assets in general. So there would be many more blind spots. The proverbial fog of war would probably return to certain parts of the battlefield. And it would be most likely an attritional slugfest over long distances. And that to me is a worrying proposition, just because the United States is the most important country in the world. It's still within limits now, obviously upholding the global, a certain world order at least. And the United States engaged in the war in East Asia, the U.S. Navy, I don't know, wrecking a third of its fleet for the defense of Taiwan. This will have large scale repercussions for the rest of the world, even if people in Europe and other parts of the world would not know it immediately. But I think these are the sort of questions that force planners, or at least military strategists, policymakers, first and foremost, need to be asking. Is it worthwhile risking all of this, or defending it, and maybe perhaps preserving Taiwan's independence, or at least prevent Taiwan from getting occupied by the PLA, if the costs are a certain percentage of the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force sinking to the bottom of the Taiwan Strait. Well, probably not the Taiwan Strait, but the waters around Taiwan and the waters in East Asia.
You spend a lot of time with sort of American defense planners and policymakers, and you discuss in the book how the various services are attempting to modernize, update the doctrine and the operational and strategic concepts. How have you found that process? Because I'm reminded of the Marine Force Design 2030, I believe it was, where the Marines said we're not going to do the M1 Abrams tanks anymore. We're going to distributed operations across smaller components, and the uproar that was met with. How have you found sort of this institutional adaptation? Is it slow yet steady? Is it still halting? How would you grade the service's adaptation in this?
Yes, I think first and foremost, it's a cultural issue, and it's always about culture, right? Culture beats doctrine, culture beats force structure, culture beats basically uh, everything. And so there is obviously a certain resistance, particularly in the United States Marine Corps. Although I have to say, talking to Marines and people within the U.S. Marine Corps, the Marine Corps is probably the furthest advanced. And it has clearly understood that it's most likely not possible to achieve information superiority and information dominance, but it also has somewhat of a degraded role, I would say, in a war against China, particularly if you implement concepts around Force Design 2030, where the U.S. Marine Corps, and I know that Marines probably wouldn't like to hear that, has somewhat of a passive role in comparison to other conflicts. It is sort of enabling naval and air capabilities in a way, right? And that's not entirely true. I know that there are different mission sets for the U.S. Marines, um, but I think the larger issue here is that all of the service branches in the United States are working on new operational concepts and are testing them out, but they're somewhat disentangled from the strategic level or the larger political level in all of this. That's what I've found when I was looking at these different concepts, and some of them also are really predicated on a certain level of political support that might not be forthcoming from host nations in East Asia, for example. But also, basically looking at it, it's unclear to me whether these concepts and these operational concepts are really going to become a reality, because what I've seen is actually that a lot of the stuff and a lot of the testing is still fairly rudimentary by and large. I mean, there's a lot of talk about multi-domain precision fires. There's a lot of talk about a new networked way of warfare and joint all-domain command and control and all of this. But it's a piecemeal approach, and it's unclear whether this can really ever be realized. This idea of a fully integrated and networked force capable of conducting operations across multiple domains at the same time, highly synchronized, this enhanced form of combined arms warfare because of technical challenges, cultural issues, and I think the main issue that I have with a lot of these concepts is that, based on my research, what I've noticed is that a lot of what we are seeing is actually not somebody developing an operational concept and then identifying the capabilities that this concept would actually need, but it's very often the other way around. For political reasons or reasons that I'm not privy to, you have a capability that is about to get introduced into a service branch, and then you need to come up with an operational concept and so forth. And that's something that's it's not unique to the United States, but I do think it says something about the procurement process, the Iron Triangle in that I'm sure you're very familiar with, right? In procurement, and that to me is actually sort of worrisome, because it also explains to me why some of these concepts seem somewhat not outdated, but maybe not up to the task, right? Because you have a capability that might not be suitable for the operational concepts, and so you compromise and try to build a concept around this. And that to me, yeah, it's something interesting, and that I didn't really expect at the beginning of my research.
If you were to take a chance at sitting down with Secretary Hegseth and advising him and the Pentagon of how to shift sort of culturally, but strategically and doctrinally to prepare for this protracted attritional, as you said, day 30, day 60 fight? What are those two or three pieces of advice or recommendations you would say to focus on? Because again, you have administrations trying to boil the ocean, but what are those two or three things that you would say this is what you should really focus on to deliver the greatest likelihood of deterring conflict in the first instance, but getting through the conflict in the event that it should come to pass?
Yes, I think the first thing that I would say is that wars are essentially won by reserves. So look at your reserve system, look at your stockpiles. I know I said that maybe 10 times the amount of precision guided munitions are not going to make much of a difference, but at the end of the day, if you're the Secretary of Defense and you need to get your forces ready for a potential great power war, that's what you still need to be doing, right? Stockpiles, reserves, build up your reserves. It's clear that the United States at its current size cannot fight two theater wars, and that's an issue. And of course, the adversaries will know that. So the chances are really increasing by the current size and force structure of the United States Armed Forces and capabilities that the United States currently has, that if Russia attacks NATO, if Russia is attempting some kind of military adventure in Europe, China could seize the moment and attempt something in East Asia and vice versa, right? So the United States will have to be ready to essentially conduct two large-scale military campaigns at the same time, like it did during the Second World War. And the United States is simply not capable of doing that. It doesn't have the defense industrial base, it doesn't have the reserves, it doesn't have the manpower. So I would say wars are won by reserves. As a result, get your reserve forces ready, get your stockpiles ready. Get your defense industry ready. And these are all really large ticket items here. And then also maybe get rid of this idea, and that goes to the heart of my book, that superior technology is going to get you out of this, or that you can actually achieve victory or achieve favorable war termination by a good and well planned out decisive strike campaign. So this idea of strike a strategy, lose this proposition, or rethink that. So these would be like my immediate thoughts in all of this. And I know these are very large discussions that we can have on each of these, but to me it's really first and foremost reserves. And I think that will have somewhat of a deterrent effect as well.
I sort of, after finishing writing this book, are you more or less optimistic about the direction in which the United States is heading in terms of what you've seen and the shifting of the concepts? You said you can't strike your way out of this. And what gives you either that optimism or the pessimism?
That's a really tough question. And you know what? It changes by the month. So let me maybe say something about my experience in Ukraine, and also overhearing conversations between U.S. military officers there, or actually engaging with U.S. military officers, and also in Europe talking to U.S. military officers. And what's interesting is that a lot of U.S. military officers, and not just people from the U.S. Navy or U.S. Air Force, don't really think that the war in Ukraine holds a lot of lessons for a war in East Asia, which is true to a certain degree, but it's also wrong. And I think a lot of it is premised on this idea: this is not how we would fight a war in the first place, and uh, we would never lose air superiority, or at least we would be able to establish temporary air superiority. And as a result, this whole drone business, this whole air parity situation, and this whole idea that our forces can get struck by adversary precision strike capabilities from the air and so forth, and this whole attritional slugfest that we're seeing in Ukraine, that's not really something that we need to worry about too much. And what I've heard over the last couple of months, often cited, is the war that we are going to fight very much will resemble Israel's strike campaigns against Iran. So an air campaign with standoff capabilities, and a mix of fourth generation, fifth generation combat aircraft, superior ISR, and essentially quickly dismantling the adversary's AD bubble, right? And once we have that, we have air superiority, and we can basically do what we want, right? And I think that's a mistake, but it feeds into pre-existing cultural traits within certain service branches in the United States Armed Forces. And that sort of worries me because in the first year of the war in Ukraine, people were maybe jumping too quickly on when it comes to conclusions and saying, okay, this is Ukraine is the future of war essentially. But what I've seen now over the last couple of months and years that a lot of people are actually fairly skeptical that this war holds a lot of lessons for the U.S. Armed Forces, and that's frankly worries me to a certain degree. Also because, and that goes back to your initial question that you asked me about the American way of war, right? American way of war actually always being characterized by attrition and annihilation to a certain degree, right? That the United States, as I call it, always has been, militarily speaking, in a great power war, a comeback power, right? It usually gets a bloody nose at the beginning, and then it takes a while for it to recover, and then it's slowly gearing up for the conflict, and then it takes a while to actually win. If you think about the U.S. Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, smaller confrontations like Korea, right, that ended in stalemate and so forth. So I think right now I'm a bit more pessimistic. It could be different in a couple of weeks or months from now, but I'm a bit pessimistic also because to me it's still unclear whether there's a systematic approach within the United States Armed Forces to really try to take the right lessons from what has been happening in the Middle East and in Europe when it comes to those recent military conflicts. And perhaps, and I think it's very difficult, frankly, for the most powerful military in the world to actually be humble enough to look at all these other military confrontations and say, okay, there's something we can learn from all of this. And it's much more difficult for the United States military than for other militaries, to be honest. So that's my longer answer to your very short question.
Well, I look forward to hopefully revisiting this conversation in a few months' time where we can see whether you're still pessimistic or optimistic. On that note, I think this is going to bring this episode to a close. I want to thank Franz-Stefan for joining us today. Thanks as always to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI staff in helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts, and it will also be available on YouTube and NSI's webpage. Make sure to join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks. And as always, if you like what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. The book is How the United States Would Fight China. It is out now, as we were told at the opening of this episode, from Oxford University Press, the United States, and Hearst in London. I highly recommend picking it up. It is incredibly thought-provoking, and we've only scratched the surface of this discussion, but I look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.